Almost everybody has wondered what they would do if there was suddenly a zombie apocalypse, and Zoey, a young horror movie enthusiast, got to experience it firsthand. In her own words, she became a funny, sexy brunette zombie killer who led 3 helpless men to safety. In just a matter of days, Zoey's world collapsed into ruin as Philadelphia and then the whole eastern seaboard crumbled under the horrors of the green flu virus. But who was she before the fall? Who and what did she lose in this trauma? And how does her story end? In this video, we explore the lore and story behind Zoey in Left 4 Dead. Years before the first reported case of the green flu virus, a young Zoey grew up in a household much like any other. Her mother, Carolyn, was overbearing while her father, Wade, was supportive and protective. Because of this, Zoey and her father shared a close bond. Their relationship only grew stronger as the years went by. After finishing his shifts as a police officer, Wade often shared his favourite old horror movies with his daughter. It was their little secret, hidden from Carolyn, and over time, it sparked Zoey's deep love of film. As she grew older, Zoey's parents divorced, forcing her to split her time between 2 homes. Through it all, Wade tried to hold onto the bond they shared, often taking her to the gun range in hopes she might one day follow him into law enforcement. Although she proved to be a natural with a pistol, her desire was to make films. At approximately 18 years of age, thanks to her hard work and studies, Zoey was offered a scholarship to study at Aldrich, a film school, and so she moved away. And when she arrived and began her first semester, however, she found it was far from what she had imagined. Instead of attending lectures, Zoey stayed in her dorm room, watching old horror movies, and her grades slipped. Her professors were unimpressed and gave her a choice: stop fooling around and get her grades up, or drop out. Yet, in the grand scheme of things, their warning would soon seem trivial compared to the horrors waiting just around the corner. It was in the city of Fairfield, Pennsylvania in September of 2009 that the Civil Emergency and Defense Agency first learned of a potential biohazard outbreak. This virus showed itself in pale skin, vomiting, jaundiced eyes, and a rising tide of irritation and aggression. CEDA did not have enough information about this illness to comment on it confidently to the public, so they asked anyone displaying symptoms of the green flu virus to wash their hands, report anyone displaying symptoms, and to remain indoors if they felt unwell. Clean hands save lives, they said. It was just a virus, but they were just as clueless as everyone else. News reports, however, told a more troubling story as it spread through the city as reports increased on heightened aggressive and hostile activity. 2 days after the first reported infection, both Carolyn and Zoey traveled to Wade's apartment for dinner. With her father's support, Zoey took this opportunity to tell her mother what the school has said. She could either drop out or put in more effort. As expected, Carolyn turned the conversation back to herself, insisting that Aldrich was expensive and that she and her new boyfriend, Kevin, had trusted Zoey to make good on it, but Zoey reminded her that she had earned a scholarship to get there. The discussion quickly spiraled into another argument when Wade used the moment to suggest Zoey try the Force. He pointed out that she had already given film a chance and it had not worked out, but Carolyn refused to hear it. She did not want her daughter anywhere near that kind of danger. In her mind, Zoey simply needed to apply herself in school. It was clear that they both loved their daughter, but in very different ways. As the argument dragged on, Carolyn realized that they were not alone. A man covered in blood had forced his way into the apartment. He was one of the sick the news had warned about. Acting on instinct, Zoey pulled her mother back to protect her while Wade shouted a warning and drew his gun. But before he could fire, the man lunged at Carolyn and sank his teeth into her cheek. 3 shots to the head dropped the man where he stood. Wade rushed to his ex-wife's side, trying to keep her calm while Zoey grabbed the phone and dialed 911. The lines were jammed. It was already clear this was no ordinary flu. No matter what Cedar had said, the whole city was dealing with this issue. And then Carolyn turned. It happened in minutes, the green flu stripping away the woman they knew and leaving only rage behind. Before Wade could react, she slashed his face with her nails, and before anyone could stop her, she sank her teeth in. Zoey tried desperately to pull her mother's attention from her father, and when Carolyn did turn on her daughter and lunged, Wade fired his pistol right at her. This strain of effort drained him, and he slid back against the wall, too weak to stand. Zoey pressed her father's wound, trying to stop the bleeding, already thinking of the first aid kit, but Wade's voice stopped her. Even as his strength slipped away, his thoughts stayed on his daughter's safety. He understood what this was. The fever, the sudden violence, the way Carolyn had changed in minutes. It was all too familiar. Just like the old zombie movies he and Zoey used to watch together. He reminded her of the movies, of how the sickness always spread. Someone always had to shoot the one guy before he turned, and back then, they had laughed at those scenes. Now, he was that guy. With her father's faint command still in her ears, Zoey told him she loved him, and then pulled the trigger. In the space of minutes, an uneasy dinner with her parents had ended with both of them dead. Alone, Zoey likely took her father's pistol and stepped out into a world already teeming with the infected. The streets swarmed with violence and hunger, but a cold comfort lingered in the back of her mind. Her professors were almost certainly gone, and those long nights spent watching zombie movies had been all the preparation she would ever need for what came next. Philadelphia burned as the military attempted to secure the towns and rescue the uninfected. As the days dragged on, Cedar issued instructions to the population: avoid the infected and set up safe rooms. These were to be fortified spaces, windowless and underground, sealed with plastic sheeting and duct tape. Families were told to stockpile water, canned food, medicine, first aid kits, flashlights, and radios to wait for further orders. The promise was simple: wait out the infection and help would come. But help never did. One by one, the military's extraction points collapsed. The safe rooms, once planned to be havens where people might outlast the apocalypse, became nothing more than temporary shelters for survivors pushing towards the next uncertain sanctuary. As for Zoey, well, she pushed through the overrun streets in search for safety. Her time with her father at the gun range carried her through each encounter as she cut down the infected that crossed her path. Moving from one safe room to another, she scavenged what she could and proved herself skilled with submachine guns, hunting rifles, and pistols. Pretty much anything she could get her hands on. Over the next 2 weeks, Zoey crossed paths with 3 other survivors who proved to be just as capable as she was. Lewis, a junior systems analyst, Bill, a hardened war veteran, and Francis, a man who seemed to enjoy the nightmare they had been dragged into. They knew survival was more likely together than apart, so as a team, they pushed towards an evacuation zone beyond the city. The green flu virus seemed to change by the day, throwing new and deadly challenges at the survivors with every step forward. Boomers, smokers, and tanks made a horrendous situation even worse. On one occasion, in Fairfield, Zoey heard the cries of a woman and moved to investigate, but Bill stopped her. The veteran had seen this scenario play out before. This was no woman in distress, but a special mutation of the infected, a witch. Drawn by her siren's call, victims would approach only to be torn apart in seconds. But Bill's warning was not enough. The panic of Lewis startled her anyway, and she attacked. Within seconds, the alley filled with infected. Together, they fought what they could and escaped to the safety of a rooftop. And from there, they saw the lights of Mercy Hospital, and at its top, the promise of an evacuation zone. The following days were filled with disappointment. At Mercy Hospital, their rescue helicopter, News Chopper 5, crashed after the pilot turned. So they pressed on towards Riverside, another extraction zone, only to find it had already fallen. Through it all, Zoey kept her spirits high. She and the men beside her were scratched, bitten, and battered throughout their conflict, yet none of them turned, and they began to wonder if they might be immune. As the days passed, their bond grew stronger. To Zoey, Francis was the tough guy, Lewis a friend, and Bill, well, Bill. The old war veteran was cynical about almost everything, but his loyalty was unquestionable. With each day, each battle, he grew more protective of Zoey. He filled the void of a father figure that had been torn away during that family dinner for her, and she appeared to fill a family role for him too. Meanwhile, the group often wondered if their immunity was permanent or if it might vanish with the next mutation. But not all of their talks were grim. Lewis and Francis argued over what zombieism really was, drifting into playful debates about vampires to the irritation of Bill. They began to care for each other in their own way, tending wounds, sharing nights in safe rooms, and slowly becoming a small family. As the oldest and the one with the most combat experience, Bill took on the role of the unofficial leader, though Zoey liked to joke that she was a funny, sexy brunette zombie killer who led 3 helpless men to safety. From Riverside to Newburgh and beyond, the 4 survivors repeated the same cycle. Fight their way to the next haven, reach the promise of rescue, only to watch it collapse at the last moment as the people who came to help them either turned or went crazy. When they finally pushed through the Allegheny National Forest and reached the abandoned Doherty farm, marked as Evacuation Outpost Echo, they feared it was just another failure. But then, an emergency broadcast came through the radio from the US military. At last, there was a chance of escape. The survivors requested transport and were told to hold their ground until help arrived. As the infected swarmed to the farmhouse in relentless waves, the 4 survivors fought back together, almost unstoppable in their defense. When the armored personnel carrier finally arrived and they climbed inside, Zoey felt the exhaustion crash over her. She let herself drift to sleep on Bill's shoulder in this brief moment of safety. It appeared as though the survivors had finally found relief, and as they arrived at Millhaven, a military installation, they quickly realized how tightly run the place was. Upon their first contact with the soldiers, they were ordered to lay their weapons on the floor of the vehicle and warned that if anyone tried to make a break for it, they would be shot. Francis, true to form, tried to be clever and was silenced with a blow to the mouth from the butt of a rifle. Zoey, on the other hand, asked the right questions. Where were they, and where were they being taken? The soldiers told her that they were at Millhaven and would be tested, Before anyone explained what happened to those who failed this test, Zoey witnessed it for herself. As the steadier voices of the group, Zoey and Bill cooperated with the Millhaven team and were directed to the testing lab, while Francis and Lewis were locked in containment. Even after she insisted she was not infected to the doctor here, he demanded a spit sample for testing. She repeated herself, explaining that they had walked out of Philadelphia on foot and that she had seen every kind of infected along the way. She had been bitten, scratched, bled on, even vomited on, yet she was fine. She was immune. All she wanted was to reach the safe zone with Bill, Lewis, and Francis. Rivera, the soldier assigned to protect the doctor, demanded she obey and spit in the dish. With this pressure, Zoey complied and asked if she could now be taken to Echo Base, but it was not enough. The doctor hesitated, holding back a truth he seemed unwilling to share, and asked to inspect one of the wounds she had mentioned. Zoey had had enough. She was tired of being shouted at without being given answers. Rivera, impatient and clearly terrified of infection, once again screamed at her to comply. Bill did not like Zoey being spoken to in such a way, and distracted Rivera so that she could snatch the gun and hit Rivera with it, knocking off his mask. With the upper hand at last, Zoey demanded answers as she aimed at the doctor and the soldier. She asked why were they there and why were they being kept, but Rivera was terrified. He begged them not to breathe on him, not to touch him, and not to bleed near him. Zoey and Bill could not understand why Rivera was so afraid. That was until the doctor finally explained everything to them. Their group, Zoey, Bill, Francis, and Lewis, were infected, but they did not suffer the symptoms of the virus. They were carriers. Anyone who came into contact with them was vulnerable to infection. Through their journey across Philadelphia, they had unknowingly spread the virus to every uninfected person they encountered. The pilot of the helicopter that had crashed, the owners of the boat that had offered them safe haven. They had unintentionally killed them. In that moment, Bill understood why the doctor had been so nervous from the start. Millhaven had not brought them in to save them. They had been gathered to be tested, to be used to find a cure, and then executed like lab rats. The doctor hesitantly admitted this theory was true, but insisted this was the only way, the only humane way. A cure had been attempted since the infection had spread, but there was none to be found. The virus defied everything they knew. At times it was airborne, at times it was not. It mutated daily, and every attempt to pin it down had failed. The doctor then explained the little they knew about carriers. The carrier gene was passed through the father's side. Seeing how protective Bill was of Zoey, he had assumed Bill was her father, and that was how she was immune, but this was not the case. This revelation hit Zoey hard. Her father had had the carrier gene too. He was never going to turn. He could have lived, but she had shot him. Worse still, by simply coming into contact with the uninfected, they had passed on the virus. She and her group had condemned those who had gone out of their way to help them to death. Bill could see just how much this had shaken Zoey, and by instinct, he comforted her, but there was no time to digest this information. Behind the scenes, Millhaven had entered a power struggle between Lieutenant Mora and Major Everly. In an attempt to overthrow him, Mora sounded an alarm and called for evacuation from the outpost with the belief all carriers on site were a risk to their lives. But this action, the activation of such a loud instrument, had the opposite effect of what he had wanted. It alerted every infected in the region of their presence, and the slaughter began. Though overwhelmed, Zoey readied herself to fight, just like she had done for weeks. Knowing their best chance of survival lay with Zoey and Bill, the doctor and Rivera followed them as the infected poured into Millhaven. Rivera led them to the armory where they were reunited with Francis and Lewis. With little time to spare, the 4 survivors stocked up on weapons and prepared to fight their way through the flooded military outpost towards the train depot a quarter of a mile away. On their path, more soldiers joined them, aware that the survivors had more experience with the infected than they had from their bubble inside of this outpost. One of these, Jeff, warned them that traveling to the depot was suicide, but Bill believed in his group. They had crossed Philadelphia on foot. They could survive the courtyard to the train depot. Their mission was set, but Zoey struggled. She had kept her spirits up through the ordeal, yet every time safety seemed within reach, it slipped away. To her, everything only grew darker and more hopeless, but still, she pressed on. As the leader of the growing group, Bill laid down the plan. They would head for the train depot and take the first train south. The newcomers were to stay close and hold their fire until his group moved first. If they fell behind, they would be left behind. Zoey began to question everything. She wondered why Bill specifically wanted a train that traveled south, in which he told her that this would be just the first part of his plan for survival. And secondly, she pressed him on what he had said to the soldiers that had joined them. Would he really leave them behind if they fell? With a fresh horde closing in and a tank among them, the survivors sprinted for the train depot, fighting for their lives with every step, and at last, through many close encounters, Zoey, Bill, Lewis, and Francis climbed on board the train. As it pulled away, Zoey spotted many of the men who had helped them get this far, fighting for their lives. She begged Bill to slow the train so she could pull some of them on board, but instead, the train only gathered speed. Zoey watched as they were torn apart and pleaded with Bill, but he refused. His only goal was to protect his own. The others did not matter. The train journey south was uncomfortable. Zoey was furious with Bill for what he had done. He had allowed those men to die when they could have saved them, but he explained that everything he had done was to protect the group. They just had to reach the coast to find a boat and head for the Florida Keys, a chain of islands away from civilization. This only increased Zoey's anger. Those men had died so she could hide away on an island. She did not want to vanish into obscurity. Now that they knew about carriers and what they were, she believed they could make a difference. They could find people, tell them what they knew, and help many people. Zoey clung to hope, but Bill did not. He saw only what the government would do to them, what they had already tried to do. Carriers were something to be eradicated, not helped. Bill had already done it Zoey's way. They had called the military for help and it had not worked out well. It was time for his plan. The Florida Keys would be a place without the army, without jails, without the infected, a place miles off the mainland, habitable with good weather all year round. In only a few hours, Zoey had learned her father never had to die, that she had spread the virus to everyone she had passed, and that her world had been stolen from her. Just a month earlier, she had been studying film in college. Now her future was uncertain. It was bleak. Zoey had seen Bill as a father figure, but she could not ignore how easily he had left those men behind. What if one day he left her too? Distrust and uncertainty gnawed at her, and she pulled back from him as they moved on after the train finally stopped in Rayford, Georgia. The final step of this plan was to use a sailboat to head out into the ocean, but they had to find one that worked. Through their exploration of this seaside port, the 4 survivors shot down the local infected, but that thought rattled in Zoey's brain. She loved Bill, but she did not know Bill. To their luck, they discovered a sailboat fully stocked with food, first aid and ammunition, but then they found their next obstacle. The bridge leading to the mainland was down. To raise it meant to make a lot of noise. They knew that this would alert the local infected and prepared for what they believed could be their final fight. As Zoey, Bill, Francis, and a newly injured Lewis attempted to raise the bridge, they found it had no power, but there were generators scattered around the port. While Francis and Lewis stayed on the bridge and prepared to pick off the infected as they got close, Zoey and Bill worked their way to one of the generators. In this moment alone, Bill tried to clear the air, but this time had given Zoey clarity. She understood Bill's actions, but she did not like them. Her reaction to his ability to leave those men behind had come from her trauma of being left by people, but Bill had shown time and time again he would never leave her willingly. So Zoey told him it was fine. She had already moved on. The boat was now the plan. As the generator roared to life, Bill and Zoey fought in harmony as Lewis and Francis offered support from the bridge. This was the biggest horde that they had seen, and it came from every direction. Tanks, smokers, hunters, boomers, and every kind of infected. By the time Zoey and Bill made it back to the bridge and it started to rise, they believed that finally, this was it. And then the generator failed. These 4 survivors had been through so much together in such a short amount of time, and as they began to run low on ammo, they understood that this could actually be their end. But Bill did not. He saw the 3 tanks on the way, and with a Molotov cocktail, asked Lewis, Francis, and Zoey to cover him as he jumped back onto the mainland towards the generator. This action pulled the horde's attention away from the bridge and towards Bill, and from this bridge, the 3 of them watched as Bill disappeared into the crowd. Within moments, the bridge began to move again, but Bill did not come back. He had sacrificed himself to save his family. He had done this to save Zoey. Zoey knew that Bill had sacrificed himself so that she and the others could escape, and in that moment, she finally had her answer. She understood what kind of man Bill was. He had become the father figure she had lost, someone who'd give anything to keep her safe, even his life. Before leaving, Zoey, Lewis, and Francis aided another group of survivors, and then they set out for the Florida Keys. At last, Zoey found herself agreeing with Bill. They could not save everyone. The military wanted them dead, and the best they could do was begin a new life with her new family, far from anyone who might be infected. This story is not a happy one, but at least Zoey finally found peace. Bill is my favourite Left 4 Dead character, but Zoey is pretty much a close second. I think she probably has the most tragic backstory too, having lost her parents in minutes of each other, only to find out her dad could have lived, and then she watched their next father figure die to save her. These are great stories, and that is why I love covering Valve games. While putting this together, I also saw that there was a planned love plot between Zoey and Francis, but it was scrapped because playtesters found it distracting. I'm glad, I think that would have been terrible. That was everything I wanted to say really. Not a ton to add for this one. I'm also fighting a cold currently, so I have very little energy. I'm hoping it did not reflect in this voiceover. I tried to push the energy. So if you enjoyed this video, then I would love you to subscribe to the channel, like the video if you liked it, dislike it if you did not, and let me know what you thought in the comments section below. I would also like to thank my gold tier patrons and channel members: Queen Arby, Lewis, Oren X, Drakey Phoenix, Downacal Drawings, 501st Clone Boy, Ruben Mendoza, Imperial Embers, Canifex, Jimsy, Average Soul, Azu, Jonas, Yali Rodriguez, Detroit, Motzi, Brina Lee, Jacqueline Lavelle, King Jack, Lifeblood, Reaper Gaming, Mamet, Kaida Zin, and Zuni115. What did you think of this topic? Did Bill make the correct decision in leaving behind those soldiers? And what would you like me to cover next? Let me know in the comments below. This is where our story ends. Check back soon for a new one.